Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Colin Campbell, and I'm the editor for JAR. And it's a real pleasure to be here with three leading experts in sponsorship advertising. So, first off, I'm going to go through and do some intros, and then we're going to dive into a really neat discussion, taking a look at this topic in more detail. So, first up, I'm super thrilled to introduce Angeline Close Scheinbaum. She's the Dan Duncan Professor of Sports Marketing and Associate Professor of Marketing at Clemson University. She specializes in consumer behavior, sponsorship, and experiential marketing with a focus on the sports and social media sectors. Her research has been published in top academic journals, and she has authored several books earning numerous accolades for her work in sports marketing and consumer psychology. So thank you so much for being with us today, Angeline.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Awesome. Yeah. Next up, we've got Jonathan Jensen. So Dr. Jonathan Jensen is an associate professor and associate director of the Center for Sport Management Research and Education at Texas A&M University. His research focuses on the intersection of data science and sport marketing, with over 50 peer-reviewed papers published in top academic and business journals. Dr. Jensen is a recognized leader in sport marketing research, having won multiple Paper of the Year awards and frequently presenting his work at leading conferences. It's great to have you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Colin. Appreciate all that you do for those of us in the field.
Thank you, of course. Yeah. And Dr. Lane Wakefield, we've got it as well as a clinical assistant professor of marketing at Baylor University and the director of the Center for Sales Strategy in Sport and Entertainment. He's an expert in sports partnerships and ephemeral media with research published in leading journals like JA and the Journal of Interactive Marketing. Wakefield also consults with brands on evaluating sports partnerships and advocates for partnerships in mental health. It's great to have you as well, Lane.
So excited to be here. Thanks for organizing again, Colin, and great to see Jonathan and Angeline, and thanks to everybody for tuning in.
Awesome. Yeah. And a special shout out as well too for Jonathan suggesting this webinar. And this is a great topic and really fits with, JER and all that we're focused on. And it's great to dive into this topic in more detail. So to start us off, I think it's really kind of an important question to lead off with is really what is the difference between sponsorship and traditional advertising?
Thanks, Colin. I'll jump in this one and just point out a couple of kind of important distinctions, I think, and then I'd love to hear what the other folks have to say as well. I think, first of all, there's the first distinction is there's really just no agreed upon or widely accepted metric for evaluating sponsorship effectiveness or even reach like there is for, say, television advertising with rating points, whether it's TRPs or GRPs, and however flawed that metric is, it really is. Everyone agrees that that's kind of the standard, metric that you use to, measure, television advertising reach. Just as an example, one of the reasons why I, titled my June JR article "Searching for the Holy Grail" is that in the world of sponsorship, we are truly still searching for the Holy Grail in terms of just one metric that we can use. So I think that's just an important distinction to point out. Number two, I think. The challenge is inherent in disentangling the effects of sponsorship. When you think about the overall marketing mix as just pieces of the pie, right? What percentage are you spending on, television or radio or digital or whatever? Sponsorship to me should be thought of as like the icing on that pie or the topping on the pie
Okay.
that goes across the entire pie and makes it all better, right? Rather than like a segment or a piece of the pie. That's how I've always kind of thought about it. And when you think of it that way, it's very challenging if a sponsorship is truly integrated across the entire marketing mix. It's almost impossible to disentangle those effects because the way
Right.
sponsorship is designed is to make all of those things better, right? It's integrated into digital and social and television and outdoor radio. Whether you're talking about non-traditional media or traditional media, it's integrated across the entire marketing mix. So that's one of the big challenges that we have as researchers, I think, is trying to disentangle and separate out those effects, because sponsorship is designed inherently to be integrated across the entire marketing mix.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Well,
that makes sense.
I'll add a little bit. There are probably a few things we could talk about, but one, if you know that brands spend on sponsorship 3 to 1 at least compared to advertising to reach the same number of people, then something's going on there. So there's more value to that audience. And why is that? Partly, if not solely, because of how passionate the audience is for the property involved in the partnership. So you might reach 1,000 people through advertising, but have a much different effect compared to 1,000 that were impacted by a sponsorship.
Absolutely. I'll piggyback on those great answers. Advertising is broadly in the umbrella of integrated brand promotion. So sponsorship, just like advertising, is one of the tools in our toolbox. And I love to tell our students, by the way, shout out to our Clemson Tigers who are here with us today. They've heard me say this a lot, but imagine we have a toolbox and maybe advertising is our hammer. You can do a lot with a hammer, but sometimes you need a screwdriver, and sometimes you need more precise tools to activate an engaged audience. And that's exactly what sponsorship is. It's one of our tools.
Awesome. I love those characterizations you've got. The toolbox metaphor, the icing as well too. Now I want a cake, but it really is, it makes a lot of sense, and really that insight as well too, but it's where this money is going as well, which really speaks to that importance of it. I'm curious to learn more about the different types of research you've done around sponsorship as well too, especially for folks who may be new to this area or interested in getting into it. It might be kind of interesting to sort of hear a little bit about what it is you've all researched in this area.
I'm happy to take this one. So I'll save you all some time so you don't have to do some reading. I'll give you the 4 top takeaways from our sports sponsorship work, specifically through the esteemed Journal of Advertising Research. I'll start with the newest, and I love this idea. The paper's called Faraway Fans, and what our research team was able to do is really parcel out some of the different cycling fans. Are they international fans? How many miles specifically did you come just to attend this event? And what we found, although it hadn't really been studied before, although it makes a lot of sense, is those fans that come from international destinations, they really go out of state, they go out of their way to make it to an event. Those are the people that we found where sponsorship really works the most. They have the highest engagement, they have the highest purchase intentions, they have the highest sponsor patronage. Another cool thing that we found over the years is that event sponsor fit or property fit really, really, really does matter. But shockingly, we found that the fit matters more for the sponsoring brand than it does the property. So what I'm saying is not necessarily that it's okay to have an unfitting brand and it won't impact your property. I'll give you somewhat of a tacky example. I'll always remember, I was at a professional hockey event well before having children. And I remember it was sponsored by a strip club in Vegas. And it also happened to be family night at hockey. So I always remember that as just a really tasteless example of fit when you have hockey night and family night, but then it's sponsored by a strip club and they were actually activating it. So clearly that's not best practice, but it can be even worse when the sponsor brand doesn't fit the property. A third cool finding that we found over the years is that you really got to activate your brand, and it's got to be activated in person. There's so many cool ways to do exhibits, interactive experiences with your brand, social media opportunities, opportunities to sit inside a Lexus and see some of the new features, check out some of the hybrid cars that are there on property. Doing all of these on-site activations in a low-pressure sales setting has turned out to be so beneficial for these sponsors, their brands, and the properties. Again, this activation in person is huge. You might find it shocking that I'm saying this because a lot of you know that we're doing so much work in the social and the digital space lately, but I would highly encourage our clients and our scholars to think about the power of live marketing. And in this era where we're kind of sick of digital and social media, there's definitely a dark side to social media. Maybe we should just go back to the basics and engage our customers on site through exhibits and brand activations. The last thing we found, and probably my favorite that I have been screaming from the rooftops ever since I've been an author and an academic, is that sponsorship is a beautiful lever for corporate social responsibility. We all know that companies these days are spending $500+ million on corporate social responsibility. But think of all the cool ways we can do this with sports and with sponsorships. I'll give you a couple quick examples that really have stuck with my heart. One of them was in 2005, yes, the tour of Utah, and it was sponsored by Dodge right when the Charger was being reintroduced. But something I really like, much more than the new product launch, of course, was the beneficiary aspect of the Georgia Cancer Coalition. So a certain amount of the proceeds brought in from the premier cycling event in the state of Georgia was able to go directly back into the cancer research in the state. Another healthcare related example I'll end on, one that's very near and dear to me, was with the University of Utah healthcare system worked with us at the tour of Utah to do free sun cancer screening checks at the cycling event. Now, of course, not everybody participated and it was free, but there were some people who were able to get an early diagnosis of a potentially deadly disease. And it was all in the lens of corporate social responsibility and bringing a community together through sport.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting about your description as well, too, is that I think, a lot of people I think might be related or close to doing sponsorship research, but not realize it. I think, you touched on experiential marketing, endorser advertising as well, too, CSR. And it seems like it really kind of draws on all those different kind of elements and borrows from those different areas as well, too.
Mm-hmm.
Jonathan and Lane, did you either of you want to add anything else as well, too? Or I know Angelin's done an amazing job sort of summarizing there as well, but
Yeah, I'll jump in on just spotlighting a couple of the pieces that we published in JAR over the years, really two research streams on sponsorship costs and returns, specific to Formula One racing. And really, I think the key takeaway is that when it comes to sponsorship, you need to go big or go home. That what we found was that the brands that allocated a significant amount of dollars to sponsorship were the ones that really gobbled up the returns. We have this issue of clutter, which is inherent in social, digital, and above the line advertising as well. But if you don't allocate significant number of dollars to a sponsorship, you're probably not going to stand out amongst all of that clutter. And then the most recent paper published in the June issue of JAR focused on this idea of a sponsorship retention model. And really, we explored the issue of generalizability. And that's one of the key issues I think we find a lot. And what I hear from the industry with regard to sponsorship research is, you do a great study that shows that a global sponsorship of the Olympic Games is effective at, assisting you in brand awareness or what have you. Well, there's less than 20 global sponsors of the Olympic Games. So the vast majority of clients can say, well, that really doesn't apply to me. And we find that a lot clients will say, that, this academic study doesn't, it's not about my brand, or it's not about, the type of sponsorships we engage with. So what I tried to do in that study is build a very large, 5,800 sponsorships, but more importantly, a very heterogeneous data set of a wide variety of different types of sponsorships in order to investigate what effects that we've found throughout the sponsorship marketing literature are actually generalizable to essentially all sponsorships. And fortunately, we found that things like congruence and brand equity and B2B, that things that have popped up throughout the years in sponsorship like marketing actually are generalizable across a really wide and heterogeneous sponsorship data set. So I encourage you to check that piece out.
love that article. I think that had a great reception as well, too, because of the breadth of the data that you looked at as well. It's very cool.
I'll touch on my JER piece with Kirk Wakefield, my old man, and Ann Rivers from BAV Consulting and Kevin Keller at Dartmouth. Ann Rivers made this one especially fun because she provided data from Brand Asset Evaluator of BAV Consulting, and they have tens of thousands of data points for every brand, most brands. And so
Mm-hmm.
it was so fascinating to see that they had brand personality measures in there as well. And so what we did was try and find, are there certain brand personalities that perform better or worse, spending as much money as they do? And of course there was, because personalities, as much as we know, if anybody's on the call who maybe knows more or maybe knows less about branding or sponsorship, we all know from our friends there are some personalities that make a bigger impact than others, depending on the setting that they're in. And so that's exactly what we found. People that are people, we'll switch back to brands so we don't get into some odd territory. But brands that are just traditional, reliable, straightforward, they're perceived differently than brands that are more
Mm-hmm.
fun, friendly, and social in how
Mm-hmm.
they activate, or at least how they're perceived as such. So it was a fun study, and JAR is the perfect place for a study like that for a number of reasons, and it was a lot of
Mm-hmm.
fun.
I recall that one as well too. A really nice article as well. Yeah.
Thanks.
Awesome. So yeah, lots of really neat, topics and areas to go through in research and sponsorship. And my suspicion, and I'm curious if you're all experts in this, is that there's probably some methodologies that lend themselves better to studying sponsorship than others. And I'm curious to sort of learn
Mm-hmm.
more, especially for people who might be new to this area or excited about getting into it. What are those types of methodologies that you think are best for this research, and other ones that, are better in different situations versus others too?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll
Well,
start. Oh,
I
okay, I'll
think Lane
go.
and I agreed, but we both are very passionate about this. Go ahead, Lane.
Yeah, I'll jump out and why don't I just give a brief history of maybe how things are on the practitioner side, and I know that'll meld into maybe what academics might care about. And I bet we have a mix of people interested in one or the other of those sides of things. So what we find continually in consulting and working with great people like Anne on our JR paper is the history of sponsorship is to think about it like any other advertising, that spots and dots, the size of the audience matters the most because that's the way to compare it to other advertising in terms of costs. And so CPMs, and it's just how can we essentially buy at the same rate as we do elsewhere, or at least comparatively. But then again, the cost is a lot more, and that didn't quite make all the sense, or at least some data was left to be desired for brands and properties because they need to know the sponsor impact. If we're going to pay more, and at different times over the years, there is more pushback from leadership to show ROI or show why are we spending that X more on sponsorship. And so then they came back to say, well, hey, we can't give just CPMs and audience numbers. Those are important. We got to know how many people are there or how many people are participating or involved in one way or the other. But we're there to change people's minds. And so how do we capture that? And so that, for example, SoFi Stadium, SoFi did that deal because they wanted to earn brand trust. And so you can't measure brand trust by knowing how many people saw their advertising. And so surveys and interviews are fairly common. Surveys is what I know far more about. And one thing I'll point out and then kick it over to Angelin is survey sampling and design matters a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Survey
Okay.
design, we'll start with sampling, I guess. Sampling, what I've seen happen, and I guess what we have a lot of experience in doing, what I've seen happen is samples can over-index on, let's say, fans that are attending a game or ones that aren't. And for NFL, for example, we measure with the Packers, and like very small percentage of Packers fans ever go to a game. Yet, if you were to only attend or grab, the fan sample from there, then you wouldn't have an accurate depiction of what sponsors are paying for, who the audience actually
Mm-hmm.
is. And so it's we aren't going to talk politics on here, but since we're in that season, you know how states and districts are called well before a large percentage of the votes are in because the sample that they have, right, matches the population or as close as they can. And so we do that in our consulting work, and I encourage others, to do the same. And then quickly on design, it's it's almost like seeing the nurse versus the doctor. If you have a problem, you want to see the doctor at some point to really understand or get somebody in there to understand what they're doing. And what we find is a handful of properties at least will trust survey design to someone without survey design training. And so
Mm-hmm.
that
Yeah.
makes results difficult to for a brand to trust or for a brand to even value the surveying process. So a lot there, mostly on the practitioner side. But Angelin, what would you like to add or jump in?
Absolutely. So Lane is spot on. In fact, Lane and I, actually your father and I recently got back from AMA in Boston, and we did the same panel, and we really went in depth about some of the best practices for methods and designs. And I am a huge proponent and advocate of field studies for this topic. There's a lot of reasons why. First of all, because sports are different. Like Colin earlier said, they are definitely an experiential topic. And people experience sport much more than a service. Again, it's an experience. So, because of this, I'm a big fan of the in-person sampling techniques, whether it be a field study, a field experiment, et cetera. When it's on site, you're able to capture that engagement. You're able to capture the authentic fan, the sincere fan, and avoid some of these sampling problems that we've seen in the field where people self-identify as fans. Now, to Lane's point, when it's talking about something like the NFL, obviously sports in person is a luxury. But what I've been able to study, particularly in some of the more niche sports like cycling, tennis, a lot of events, keep in mind, are non-ticketed events. And I think this is super important for methods when we're doing field studies. Ask yourself, is this a ticketed event versus a non-ticketed event? So to Lane's great point about the Green Bay Packers, it's such a luxury experience to go to any NFL this day that you can have a different sampling technique. But when you think about a non-ticketed sport like cycling, it's more of really a community event. So people there, when we're sampling this, you're getting a nice sample of these different communities. So I think that's really important. Also, on the sampling aspect with field studies, I do think it's important to make sure that you're understanding who is running the study. That might be just simply for IRB purposes, and that's always important as well. But really, to Lane's earlier point, it is so crucial to have your hand in that design for the surveys and the studies. As academics, we all know that we need multi-item measures, especially with your dependent variable. But from a practitioner's point of view, it doesn't always make sense why we're asking about brand personality or attitude or engagement with a 5-item Likert scale. And really, for parsimony in the field, when we're trying to activate these studies in the field, you've got to think about the time component. So people are rushing, people are on their way to the race, people are on their way to the finish line. And it's really not appropriate to be doing a 2-page in-depth study with qualitative inquiry. What partners want, what brands want, is their KPIs, their key performance indicators. And shockingly, these KPIs are often one question. Are you satisfied with Volkswagen, right? Are you satisfied with Red Bull? Were you satisfied with this event? Now, you and I all know in the academic world, that's not going to fly. So my great advice to you, working in field studies, definitely do it. It's a great way to get involved in your local communities, helping out. But make sure you really do have a hand in that study design. Make sure that you have a moderator or a mediator that is managerially actionable. Make sure that your dependent variable does have different ways of measurement. Make sure that there is some rigor as well as relevance in there.
Great point. I just wanted to just piggyback on one thing that Lane mentioned. I think it's another important distinction is that we've all done studies about brand awareness as measured by recall and recognition, and it's generally the most cited objective of sponsorship from by managers and advertisers. But the challenge is we all would agree that sponsorship is probably the worst way to deliver brand awareness because it's never going to be as efficient, as just putting a billboard on the side of the road, what have you, because, sponsorship is designed to influence individuals much lower down in the purchase funnel. I think Lane made the point, sponsorship is designed to change your mind, right? Rather than simply becoming aware of something. So that's another one of the inherent challenges is it's generally used to generate brand awareness, but I've used impression-based models like the ones Lane mentioned to look at CPMs and impressions, and they're helpful for kind of comparing the reach of sponsorships against one another, but they're always going to fall short once you try to compare them to, other elements in the marketing mix. And then a client is going to look at it and say, well, I'm spending so much more on the sponsorship to reach this little amount of people. And we have to explain to them, well, that's not what sponsorship is designed to do. Yes, you're going to get impressions from that sign in the stadium, or on the wall at the ballpark, but that's really not what it's designed to do. Methodologically, just to fall back on your question, what I've tried to do, especially recently, is just analyze longitudinal data. It sounds simple, but we did an analysis a while back of a leading journal in sport, and less than 5% of the papers actually analyze longitudinal data. And it's really difficult to obviously argue with causal inference when you don't have longitudinal data. So we published a study last year in Sport Marketing Quarterly. We looked at about 15 years worth of data, and Lane's done a lot of this type of work as well, where you can look at how the effects of sponsorship actually either increase or decrease over time. And we found in that study that we figured that the effectiveness of sponsorship on brand awareness would actually increase over time the longer that you're a sponsor. What we found is actually the opposite. There was a short-term bump, a nice bump, a statistically significant bump, but then the effects actually waned after a couple of years and went back to where they were. So whenever possible, try to, at minimum, 2 points in time, but really try to analyze longitudinal data. And that's something we've been working on in several studies recently.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks for the description. That's awesome. I want to encourage people who are viewing as well too. If you have questions, please throw those in the Q&A box as well. We'll try to get to as many of those as possible. So thanks for the overview of the different types of methodologies that are possible. I'm wondering, doing field studies seems like obviously like a lot more work to go through and do. And I'm wondering,
Mm-hmm.
like, are there any tips on how to approach, companies or sponsors to work with them on that? And B, when to know when it's most appropriate to do that versus perhaps a less effortful methodology as well.
I'm happy to help with this one because it is my primary method of inquiry. I'll tell you how I got started. Maybe this will be inspiring for some, and give a lot of you, especially our students out there, some really great ideas. So when I was a doctoral student at the University of Georgia, I was asked to teach a class called marketing research. And of course, I'd barely ever taken the class, let alone taught it. And I remember I went and I got a book from Naresh Malhotra at the time from Georgia Tech. He gave me his instructor manual. And I read the book. It's a great book, but I thought, good Lord, I'm not going to teach marketing research to University of Georgia students by giving them this book. It's full of statistics. So what happened at the time was, I love cycling, by the way. I'm a big Peloton enthusiast, for those of you who may know this about me. But in my smallish town, there was this event called the Dodge Tour de Georgia. I alluded to it earlier. And the purpose of the sponsorship was really to reactivate the Charger. What I thought would be cool, I did not know what I was getting into. As Colin alluded to, this is a massive undertaking. Keep in mind, I'm in my 20s, I'm a student, and this is my legit first time teaching. I decide we're going to do a massive field study together, and we're going to partner with Dodge and the Tour of Georgia. It was a multi-day data collection event, and obviously months go into this. Like we said, designing the survey, doing IRBs, working with corporate partners. I didn't charge $1, right? So that is a huge tip. Your first time, you can't necessarily charge, right? What did I have to offer? A lot of energy, a lot of passion, borderline obsession, and a lot of boots on the ground, hardworking University of Georgia business students. It ended up being a lot of work. I'm not going to lie and say it was easy and all things went well. We learned a lot, and we had to go back and recode that data electronically. And that's when I learned the real importance of marking each survey on paper. So when you code it, you know it's been coded correctly, like these types of things. But I will tell you that that was an awesome teaching experience. The students loved it. It was one of the best outcomes for the company. for the state of Georgia, for the Georgia Cancer Coalition. And in essence, what happened, because we did such a good job, guess what happened? Next year, the annual event came, and I want to say it was sponsored by Ford, and they contacted me. Guess what happened the next year? AT&T picked up the bill, right? So word of mouth, as academics, we know is super powerful. If my story works for you, and God, I hope it does, find a community partner. Maybe start with your university. A lot of us have amazing athletic departments. I know we do here at Clemson. I've been working with the University of Texas at Austin and UNLV, who, by the way, has a football ranking today for the first or second time in history. So in doing all this, work with your local athletic department, work with community sponsors, bring your students in. My students are here. Maybe they can allude to this. I think they love this kind of stuff. And you will grow your business. I was able to incorporate a very small LLC in the state of Texas in 2011. It's still running. It's called Event Sponsorship Measurement LLC. That has been entirely driven based on word of mouth.
It's awesome. Yeah.
I do a fair amount of field study, research or help in that. I mentioned my dad, Kirk, he runs Wakefield. We do nearly all surveys online, sent through the property. So occasionally, once in a blue moon, we do some in-person intercept, which has its advantages, like Angela mentioned, has some drawbacks too from the challenge. Since she mentioned her origin story, I cut my teeth unknowingly in sponsorship research as a kid going to AAA baseball games and picking up surveys from fans with a big box, going down the rows, and then made my nickels, checking to see if people didn't circle all the sevens or like did things that weren't going to be able to input, and then got old enough to input them a little bit. So I'm just having fun, doing what I think any kid does, try to tag along with their mom or dad or whoever's with them. All to say, the field study data is just as valuable as long as it matches the audience. And so if you have the right sample, where you get it matters a little less, as long as you have the boots on the ground you need, or basically the resources in line.
Mm-hmm.
Love those stories and also the tips as well too. That's fantastic. I've got a question that came in from the audience, which is, do you have any thoughts on a financial metric that is being or can be used to measure the total short and long-term financial returns of sponsorship investments?
I'll jump on that one because Lane and I have actually done some work in that area. The most frequent approach is shareholder value. Looking at how for example, the initial announcement of a sponsorship impacts the stock price of the firm. So that's probably the best proxy for the financial impact of sponsorship. You know, Cornwell and Kwan did an excellent meta-analysis of this work a few years ago, and they actually found once you look at it in its totality that there actually is not an effect of an initial investment in sponsorship on kind of the financial health of the company, using shareholder value as a proxy. And I think we would all agree that the reason for that is that the simple start of a sponsorship is really just the tip of the iceberg. The idea is you invest activation and it grows over time as you invest more dollars in the sponsorship. So that all makes sense. So one of the things we've been doing to kind of tweak that a little bit is you look at how switches in sponsorship impact financials in terms of shareholder value. Lane and I published a paper on that last year where it kind of controls for one sponsor switching out for the other. And we're working on a paper right now where we look at competitive sponsorships, so exclusive sponsorships where you have a Coke versus a Pepsi, or auto credit cards, those categories. What happens when a new sponsor takes over for a former sponsor? So because of that work by Cornwell and Kwan, essentially learned that you really just can't look at the start of the sponsorship. So we've kind of moved to looking at kind of the dynamics of the brands and how that impacts things. So that's the most frequent way we've looked at it. Of course, that's only available for publicly traded firms. We talk about the initial the issue of generalizability. It's just not generalizable to privately held firms, smaller firms. Really, only that research is really only generalizable to large conglomerates. So again, we're looking at other ways in which to assess the effectiveness of sponsorship, because shareholder price is something that can only be applied to these large publicly traded conglomerates.
Mm-hmm.
So we measure hundreds of partnerships a year, and it's about the KPIs. Angela brought that up. I guess one reason that's so hard to find a metric, although we found some things in prior work, and there's quality work out there on that. What makes it so hard is if it's the icing on the cake and it's a part of everything, you've got an attribution problem that's near impossible to solve. And so what we can do, though, is isolate the people who only saw the partnership or compare them to those that aren't aware of the partnership, and then assess the KPIs that the brand is interested in. So time and again, every brand that we work with can tell you what their goal is, but it's not based on a return.
Mm-hmm. And I can jump in with two more metrics. We love metrics, don't we? I've got a couple cool ones that maybe we haven't considered. My first favorite one is really more for the city and the community and the partnership and the property, not necessarily the brand or the sponsor, but it's called economic impact. Of course, we get this from the economics literature, but the formula is actually quite simple. I'm oversimplifying it for purposes of this webinar. But really what you want to do is you want to figure out how much revenue came into a property or a city or a state or a territory as a direct result from this event, specifically sporting event. So what these are called are dedicated fans. So say Lane goes out to eat in Baylor, but he works there, or he stays at a Airbnb, but he works there. That's not necessarily a dedicated fan. Now, having someone come in town to go to, say, a Clemson football game, that would be an example of a dedicated fan. So first step one is you got to parcel out who are the dedicated fans versus the not. Then you get a lot of indicators such as the money spent on transportation, the money spent on hotels or tourism, the amount spent on tickets, of course, if it is a ticketed event, the amount spent on souvenirs. Then you multiply that by the party size. So what we're able to do, and the crowd estimate. Now, that's hard to do. A lot of times I work with the police stations and we get police drones out there to make audience sizes. Otherwise, there's really no good way to do that. So that's a pretty cool tip. Get your police force involved. They're honestly happy to work with us. And then we're able to do a multiplier effect. So I can give you the more or less, I give conservative estimates and then I give more liberal estimates, usually to partners. But I'm able to calculate a specific dollar valuation of the economic impact. Usually, and in my experience, it has been in the millions, sometimes multiple millions. Why is this important? Because you take that data, you go back to the city, you go back to the governments, you go back to the clients, you go back to the properties, and you are able to justify, especially in hard PR times when the locals complain, yeah, there's no hotel reservations left. Well, yeah, it's a Clemson home football game, right? Or the traffic is out, or I'm being inconvenienced for these ways. It really becomes a public relations tool where you can say, look how many jobs we were able to create. Look how much economic impact was able to come in. Specifically when we're talking about college towns, right? Like Clemson, or maybe some smaller communities through the state of Georgia where cycling tours would go through. This revenue is paramount. The second cool metric I wanted to mention, because I'm surprised it hasn't come up yet, given that we are here in the Journal of Advertising Research seminar, is a really cool metric. I know it has flaws, but it's quite simple, is the AEV. And what this means is your advertising equivalency valuation. So if we can get this data, for the most part, you can figure out how much media presence would cost. So say, for example, if we're able to see that Shell, as the sponsor of the Shell Houston Open, which was a PGA golf tournament, say we got X million impressions at that particular golf event. What we're able to do is say, okay, if we were to buy advertising for Shell, if we were to buy ads at a PGA event for X number of exposures, how much would that have cost? And as my colleagues alluded to earlier, sponsorship can be a much more effective metric because when you do AEV models, in my experience, I've almost always found that sponsorship is a better deal for an ROI perspective than advertising is. My theory and what I've been saying for a long time, it goes back to my earlier point. I think it's because of the in-person engagement that we're able to have at these events.
That's really interesting. Yeah, thank you so much for the detailed answers there. And if other folks have questions, we encourage you to throw those in the Q&A box as well too. It's always good to get those answered. We're rounding out a bit. Time flies. It's crazy when you're talking about interesting stuff. I wanted to turn to, oh, we got another question just came in. But how would you measure B2B sponsorship? To the question on that, sort of dovetailing on the earlier one we had. Yeah.
Ironically, B2B sponsorships are actually one of the easier ones to study because it generally leads to direct sales. So the famous example case study that a lot of people use is Mead Paper. Mead Paper literally sponsored NASCAR in order to sell paper to other companies like UPS and FedEx and everyone else. So they were really not that interested in the consumer effects or the advertising equivalency. They just wanted to essentially develop relationships with other sponsors. So, and we always include a variable about whether a sponsor is primarily B2C and B2B, and when we actually find that it's usually about half and half, that everybody thinks of sponsors as just, well, Coke and Pepsi, et cetera. But there are a lot of sponsors that are really focused on that B2B engagement. And generally, those are even easier to isolate because you essentially can say, well, what other sponsors, in the example of NASCAR's Business Council, what other sponsors did we sell to? And then you're able to attribute it quite easily to the sponsorship because we know when we became a NASCAR sponsor, we entered into this kind of small group of other large companies, and we're able to then attribute the sale to that. So that's generally the way you do it, is through direct sales.
Mm-hmm. And just to add to that real quick, Jonathan is spot on when he suggests to make sure you do have an indicator on your survey, whether it's in person or online. Is this B2B or B2C? Let me give you a quick example of why this is really important. So in our study with Shell at the golf event, they, as the main partner, had hospitality suites and hospitality boxes. So when we were do sampling there, from that point of view, almost everyone in those VIP boxes were channel partners or suppliers. However, when we moved our sampling arena down to the course, it's the same brand, right? It's the same company in the same survey, but those fans were regular people like you and I who may or may not put Shell into our cars. Had we not remembered to put that little one yes or no B2B versus B2C question in, we wouldn't be able to split that data and really tell the company if and when and how it's working from a B2B to a B2C lens. It's a super easy measure to throw in. It's literally a yes or no question. But if you don't do it, you can't ad hoc that. Because again, with the example of Shell, if I were to ask my students right now, hey, is Shell a B2B company or a B2C company? That's not an easy answer because it depends.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. Anything you wanted to add, Lane, or are you good?
They covered it well.
That's
I've got some thoughts, but nothing worth sharing.
okay, cool. Well, I want to pivot to talking about opportunities where research is needed. More research is needed in sponsorship. So, any areas you think that are underserved or that we need to do more research? And I'm sure there's many in sponsorship.
I'll jump in on this one. Two, I guess one conceptual idea, and then, well, yeah. So starting out, making sure that research is including each entity in sponsorship. So brands, consumers, and properties. Most sponsorship research includes only two of those three, whichever pair might be accessible or of interest, but sponsorship doesn't exist without all three. So seeing more research that is aware of that and includes measures to capture it takes a little more work, but I think we'll see more of it, or hope to see more of it. And then the other, I guess, more specific example or interest is the asset mix. So just as different brand personalities I talked about in the JR paper yield different results, what brands are finding different results with the same or different assets? So spending more or less money on the variety of ways they can communicate to audiences through sponsorship. How is that making an impact? And are some spending, more but getting less of an effect? So figuring out what the right asset mix is, I think, is interesting, and what brands want to know so they can, spend wisely and activate the right parts of their deal to make the most impact.
Yeah, very important.
Yeah, that's a good point, Lane. I think it's been 4 years since Cornwell and Kwan's paper in JAMS that basically looked at the prior 20 years of sponsorship research. And if you're interested in this area, I would encourage you to check out that paper. They built a really nice conceptual model that kind of wraps up the past 2 decades of sponsorship research. But what I took from that article is what they found was that there's an over-reliance on the consumer effects of sponsorship, and there needs to be more research about the corporate side, what we call managerial decision making. And from my time, the 10 years I spent on the agency world working with clients, I call it kind of abnormal psychology, because getting into the minds of corporate decision makers is oftentimes quite fun, because they make a lot of suboptimal decisions, right? They things like hometown sponsorships, where they want to be the person to use the suite and sit on courtside, and sometimes even walk out to the center of the court to flip the coin flip. So they make a lot of suboptimal decisions. So what I've found over the past several years is analyzing those decisions can often be quite fun, because you get a lot of unexpected results. So I've kind of taken that piece from the literature and kind of redoubled my efforts to, yes, we all do consumer studies and experimental designs and surveys, but to try to dive into the minds, of the advertiser or the corporate decision maker over the past few years. So I would love more people to examine that side of it in terms of, how and why the advertisers are making these sponsorship related decisions.
Yeah, those are all great answers. So I would encourage scholars, people who are wanting to do their theses or dissertations on this, or really, really work in the real world for this. There's a really great book. It's just literally called Sponsorship and Marketing by our queen, Dr. Bettina Cornwell at the University of Oregon. That's a great place to start, honestly, because it's a nice framework that walks through the effectiveness of communication and marketing strategies through sports, through arts, and the events. But with respect to hot topics, what do I see as must-dos for our industry? You're probably going to think I'm going to say something techy, like, I don't know, AI in sports, or cryptocurrency, or non-fungible tokens in sports, right? Or even something more cultural, like race, gender, and the Caitlin Clark effect, right? So I think going forward, again, that maybe we should look at less digital things and look at more cultural, real world phenomena. I think a super hot topic for sports right now is the topic of cancel culture. There's really not a lot out there. There's a great piece in Journal of Macro Marketing. Desmar and Sands, I believe, are the authors. And it's an awesome way to introduce what is cancel culture. I would love, love, love to see this done more in the sport or sponsorship arena, because if you think of what is getting canceled, who is getting canceled, are they brands? Are they athletes? Are they the companies themselves, and how can companies use sponsorship or community partnerships either as a post-cancellation strategy or going back to, say, endorsers. I know, bringing this full circle, Colin mentioned that there could be some cool work done on endorsements or influencers, more or less the same thing. What happens when those athletes get canceled? Going back to some very political times, think of the Green Bay Packers quarterback at the time, Aaron Rodgers, refusing to get a vaccination. Think of the NBA bubble effect that was going on during these times. So, to what extent are these athletes or teams or even leagues getting super bad press or even canceled? How can we as marketers or sponsors kind of rebuild that trust and help properties and brands and communities in this age of cancel culture?
Oh, really interesting. Yeah. So thank you for those great suggestions and ideas. Hopefully they spark some interest in people who are listening. As we kind of round out as well, too, I wanted to swap next to talking about publishing. And I know publishing can always be challenging, irrespective of whatever the topic is. But what are some challenges that might be unique to sponsorship research and any sort of tips on how to overcome those?
I'll start with JAR is a wonderful place for working with practitioners. I mentioned Ann's work, but we've got some more in the pipe and targeting JAR because of that. Less, it's harder for practitioners to care or grasp or don't see as much value in the literature reviews and the what you might have to do for other journals for the academic crowd. But JAR has such a nice combination of academics and practitioners in the audience that it makes it ideal for a practitioner to say, yeah, I'll offer some data and I want to learn about this and I want to be involved and maybe publish a paper. Whereas it's going to be really hard for them to be helpful to academics, at least as an author, at a journal of advertising, for example, as wonderful as that is, it's not a fit for their background or their ability to help other than just handing over the data. At JAR, that person can be involved throughout and give more input and likely have more interest in whatever the research question is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good point about the distinctiveness of JR Lane. There's a management slant right on the first page that they force us to write. What does this mean for managers, right? 3 or 4 bullet points. It's simple, but how often do you see that? We write abstracts, but what does this mean for managers? So that's a nice tool. Since taking over as editor, Colin's done a great job of doing these webinars and getting these topics out into just the mainstream area. Of course, they're really helpful for students and academics, but getting this out to folks in the outside of the academy is important. There's a new organization called the Sponsorship Marketing Association that just launched. Paula Beadle, who is in Seattle and used to be a brand decision maker, and a former colleague of mine, Matt Pensiger, just started it, and they just had their conference this week, and which was great, but I don't think they had any academics and had nobody providing any academic research. So we're still struggling to just cross that bridge and that divide between academia and industry. So some of these tools that JR is using you really help in that area.
Mm-hmm. And then a final point to piggyback on this is really the collaboration with MSI, Marketing Science Institute. A lot of scholars really get excited when these research priorities come out from these big think tanks. And I know JAR has especially been very good at this. So when these think tanks come out once a year or so saying, look, these are the 4 or 5 things that we really believe are important for academics and practitioners to come together to solve for social impact, for economic impact, just for societal studies in particular. I think this is really important. I highly encourage scholars to go check those out. Again, they're easily available. And I think you will start to see, if you have a latent interest in sponsorship or advertising, that there's going to be so many cool areas where you can use those priorities from either Marketing Science Institute or the Advertising Research Foundation or Federation to really get some ideas, but make it your own, make it passion. I noticed Lane used the word fun a few times in this webinar, and it made me smile because this is fun, right? What we're doing is literally amazing. We're going to sporting events, we're measuring community engagement, we're doing social impact. We are able to be so in touch with the heart and the soul of our communities and our fans. And at the end of the day, it's obviously exhausting, but it's fun. Our sports marketing classes sell out because these are classes and careers that people want to do because of this innate passion. So if this webinar has done anything for you, I highly encourage you to ask yourself, how can you get involved in sponsorship or in sports specifically? What are you passionate about? Whether it's pickleball or Peloton cycling or cricket or NFL, what can you do that's in your sport of passion that aligns with these MSI or ARF initiatives, and you can make a difference?
Awesome. Thank you for all of sharing all your passion, and also as well too for talking so kindly about JAR as well. I think the authors really, you folks are the ones who are the stars for doing all the great work that you do, and it's really just my job to help get that out there and really sort of elevate and promote the great work that you all do. So thank you for doing that. As we close out, I just wanted to talk briefly about the Media Probe data release that we have that's available, and it's open for, I think, another 10 days or so. And honestly, I had not thought about this in the context of sponsorship. But Jonathan, you were the one who brought that up, and you're very passionate about that. So it's a data release that Media Probe, they're making available on more than 10,000 ads, I think it is. I'm just thinking off the top of my head here. And that they have skin response, skin conductance ratings for that, and they're making this available for free to academics. And did you want to talk a little bit more about that, Jonathan, how it's relevant to sponsorship?
Yeah, I think it's obviously it's an interesting data set. I think you have more than 200 people participate in the study. But what's interesting to me is that you've got a variety of different ads from a variety of different clients, but some of them happen during sports events. Particularly, there's a number of soccer events, I think World Cup events and the Super Bowl. But then some of those same commercials are happening during other programming. And one of the things that we've looked at is so when you're super engaged in a broadcast of a sports event, are you more likely to pay attention to the ad, or is it the opposite effect? I think you could argue either that the less engaged you are with the content, perhaps the more effective the ad is. So that's just one idea they've kind of thrown out, is what happens, is the same ad more or less effective when it happens during a sports event, or not? And then obviously from a sponsorship perspective, sponsorships are part of those ads, and we know kind of the brands that are integrated into those, for example, like the signs at the during the World Cup. So is it possible to measure the consumer response using, I think it was biometric data that Media Probe is using? Is it possible to essentially isolate that effectiveness of the sponsorship that happens during the broadcast, not during the ad? So a couple things that we're hoping to perhaps investigate with that data.
That sounds very neat. Yeah. Well, I think we're almost out of time here, so I wanted to close by thanking Jonathan for suggesting this webinar. It's been super helpful and very enlightening. And I also want to really appreciate the fact that all of you have come. So thank you, Jonathan, Lane, and Angeline, of course, for making it today and sharing your expertise with everybody.
Thanks for having us.
Very welcome. Enjoyed it.
Awesome. We'll post this on our YouTube channel as well, too, so people can watch it again later as well. Awesome. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
Colin.